A woman worth more money than I will ever be able to wrap my head around offered me $750,000 cash to start her dead father's boat. Real engineers came first. Marine specialists flew up from Florida. A fellow who'd rebuilt engines for the offshore racing circuit drove all the way from Montreal with a trailer full of equipment that cost more than my house. Every last one of them gave it a go. Every last one of them packed up and drove back down the highway with nothing to show for it. And that beautiful old mahogany launch just sat there in the boathouse, dead quiet, rocking a little on the lake water like it was holding its breath, and had decided it wasn't ever going to let it go. And then a tired, middle-aged boat mechanic in a clean shirt with somebody else's grease worked permanent into the cuffs. That would be me, came walking down the dock, looked her in the eye, and told her I didn't want the money. I wanted a beat-up brass tag and a little flat key on a frayed bootlace that the whole estate had already written off as garbage. Everybody standing in that boathouse laughed at me. Genevieve didn't, because something in my face must have told her I wasn't making a joke, and something in my face must have told her that I'd known her father. And about 8 minutes after that silent old launch came roaring back to life and filled that whole boathouse wall to wall in a way that put every credentialed expert who'd touched it to shame. Not because I'm smarter than those men. I want to be straight with you about that right from the top. I'm not. Every single one of them walked down that dock and saw a machine. I walked down it and remembered a man. But before I tell you about the bootlace, and before I tell you what made a woman who could buy anything on this earth fold up and cry on a cold cedar floor, do me one quick favor. If you've ever lost somebody and you'd hand over everything you own just to hear one small, plain, everyday sound of them one more time, go ahead and hit subscribe right now. This whole channel's built for folks who already understand that it's the littlest things that end up carrying all the weight of the love. That's it. That's all I'll ask. I'll wait right here. All right. Let me tell you about a man named Conrad Halloran and about the 26 years I spent with my hands inside his engines. My name's Walter Penner. Most everyone calls me Walt. I'm 47 and I fix boats the way my father fixed boats and his father before him. 3 generations of the same family running the same little marina up in Muskoka, on a stretch of shoreline that the rich folks discovered about 100 years ago and never let go of. I learned the trade standing on an overturned milk crate beside my dad, breathing in 2-stroke smoke and percolator coffee, the radio crackling out a Leafs game we'd already lost. He'd learned it the same way, beside his own old man. And somewhere across all those winters it stopped being just the thing we did to keep the lights on and quietly turned into the thing that we were. And I need to tell you something right here at the start, because without it, none of the rest of this will land the way it actually happened to me. I buried my own father this past spring, just before the ice went out. I'll come back around to that, because it ended up mattering more than I ever could have figured. But I need you holding it in the back of your mind the whole way through, because every single thing I'm about to tell you, I understood the way I understood it because of him. Now, Conrad Halloran. The first time he came down our dock, I was 21 and didn't know a soul who had 2 nickels to rub together, let alone a man like him. He'd made his fortune in shipping logistics, the unglamorous machinery that gets a pallet of something from a factory in one country onto a shelf in another. And by the time I met him, he had more money than the whole township put together. But here's the thing about Conrad that I learned across all those years. You would never have known it to talk to him. He came down to our marina himself. Didn't send a fellow. Didn't send 3 fellows. He drove his own truck, an old Ford, he refused to replace, and he'd come into the shop and lean on the same fender for an hour and a half talking about nothing while I worked, and at the end of it he'd shake my hand with both of his and call me by my name. He owned a boat, a 1961 Grevet launch, 26 feet of triple-planked mahogany the color of dark honey, with a chrome cutwater up front that he polished himself by hand every spring even though he could have paid 100 people to do it. He'd named her the Evelyn, after his wife, who passed when Genevieve was still small. I never met Evelyn, but I came to feel like I knew her, the way Conrad would say the name, soft, like he was setting something fragile down on a table. He brought the Evelyn to us, and only to us for 26 years, never once asked what a job would run before I did it. Not one time. He just trusted that I'd be square with him, and I trusted that he'd never make me prove it. And somewhere in that arrangement, without either of us ever saying the word out loud, The two of us became friends, the kind that don't need to announce it. 50. Conrad died in the fall, in his sleep, his heart just stopping the way it only does for the genuinely lucky ones. I put on the one suit I own and I drove down to the city for the service, and I stood at the very back of a room the size of a curling rink, the boat mechanic in among the men with their names carved on hospital wings, and I grieved my friend in private and drove home in the dark. And then, not 5 months after that, the ice barely off the lakes, I buried my own dad. And those two separate griefs braided themselves together inside my chest into one heavy rope, and in the hauling of that rope, I came to learn something about loss that I'm going to hand you now, because it's the actual key to this whole story. Pun intended, as you'll see in a minute. Here's the thing nobody warns you about when you lose someone. It isn't the big, obvious, marked on the calendar absences that finally drop you to your knees. It isn't the empty chair at the Thanksgiving table. You see that one coming a mile off, you brace for it. No. It's the small sounds. It's the ambush of realizing, out of nowhere, on a Tuesday, that you are never going to hear that person clear their throat in the next room again. Never hear them hum some half-remembered tune while they scrape a plate. Never hear the particular way they set a mug down. After my dad passed, I'd have given anything I owned, anything at all, to hear the scrape of his snow shovel on the driveway one more time. That's a strange thing to grieve, I know it. But my whole life, 6 in the morning, every storm, before I was even properly awake, there it was. That dry steel scrape, scrape, scrape down the length of the drive and the little grunt he'd give heaving a load up onto the bank. It meant the day had started. It meant he was out there. It meant everything was the way it was supposed to be. And that first big dump of snow we got after we put him in the ground, I lay in bed in the dark and the driveway was just silent, and I understood, lying there, that I'd have traded the marina, the truck, every dollar to my name, for 30 more seconds of an old man scraping snow off the asphalt. Just that. One small, dumb, ordinary, holy sound from a man who was never going to make another one as long as the earth turned. I didn't know it yet, standing out in that driveway in my sock feet, but the lake was about to ask me to walk into a glass boathouse and see the exact thing all those clever men couldn't see. Grief was getting me ready. That's the cruel mercy of the thing. It wrecks you, and then it makes you useful to the next poor soul it's about to wreck. Which brings us, finally, to Conrad's daughter, and to the boat that wouldn't start. Her name's Genevieve, only child, sole heir to all of it, a billionaire on paper now in her own right, though I'd come to understand pretty quick that she'd have signed every dollar of it away in a heartbeat for 5 more minutes with her dad. After Conrad passed, the lawyers did their long, slow, expensive thing, and when the dust settled, Genevieve kept the Evelyn. Of course she did. That boat was more him than the houses, more him than the company, more him than anything else he'd ever put his name on. But then here's the small, strange thing that set the whole improbable day in motion. The boat wouldn't start. It had sat untouched through the back end of the season and the long winter while the estate got sorted, up on its cradle in the heated boathouse, and when Genevieve finally went up to the lake in the spring and had it lowered into the water and went to fire it up. To hear it, I'm certain, far more than to actually take it anywhere. The thing was dead, and not the battery. That was the first thing anyone thought of, and the battery was brand new and fully charged. The engine itself was sound. The fuel was fresh, the lines were clean. Every mechanical system on that boat was, by every measure anyone could put to it, in perfect order, and yet the Evelyn just flat out refused. The starter would crank and crank and crank and never once catch. Like the boat had made some private decision, the very week its owner's heart stopped, to go quiet right alongside him. And Genevieve, drowning in grief, wealthy past the point where money means anything real, and absolutely unable to stand the idea that her father's single most beloved thing on this earth had gone silent and dead, did what people with limitless money do when they find themselves truly desperate and powerless. She threw money at it. A mountain of it. She put the word out, quietly at first and then not so quietly, that she'd pay $750,000 to anyone alive who could start her late father's boat. And honestly, I don't think she gave 2 hoots about being able to drive it anywhere. I don't think that was it at all. I think she just needed, with a need that had clawed all the way down to the bone, to hear it run one more time, same exact way I needed that snow shovel. And they came. Lord, did they come. Marine specialists with letters after their names. A fellow who built race engines, like I said, who drove up from Montreal, restoration experts who handle museum boats hauling diagnostic gear in hard cases lined with gray foam. For $750,000, the finest mind's money could pull out of the woodwork descended on that boathouse and plugged in their laptops and ran their tests. And one by one, every single one of them slowly lost his mind. Because every test any of them ran kept telling them the same impossible thing, over and over. There is nothing wrong with this boat, nothing. And yet it would not start. I only heard about any of it because Conrad's estate lawyer, a decent man named Brennan, happened to remember my name. Remembered, somewhere in a file, that old Conrad Halloran had kept one particular mechanic he trusted above all the rest for the better part of 30 years. And he phoned me, almost as an afterthought, and I could hear the apology already in his voice, calling a small marina grease monkey up north after 3 solid weeks of the best people in the country had thrown up their hands. "Mr. Penner," he said, "I realize this is a long shot, and you'd of course be just as eligible for the reward as anyone, but Miss Halloran is genuinely at the end of her rope, and you did know the boat." And I very nearly told him no. I want you to know that. I was still down at the bottom of my own well, my dad only a few weeks in the ground, and I had no stomach for a circus, but I had loved Conrad Halloran for 26 years. So in the end I got in the truck and drove up the lake one last time, the same drive I'd made 1,000 times, to put my hands on his boat one final time. The boathouse was a thing to behold. New build, all glass and pale cedar, big enough to play hockey in, with track lighting angled down like it was a gallery and the boat was the painting. And there in the middle of it, up on its lift just above the black water, sat the Evelyn, gleaming and silent and beautiful, surrounded on every side by the wreckage of expert failure, abandoned test gear, a laptop gone dark to its screensaver, a couple of fellows still hunched over readouts that refused to make any kind of sense. And off to one side stood Genevieve, dressed simple, dressed expensive, perfectly composed on the surface of her and absolutely hollowed out underneath it, wearing that bone-deep tiredness that belongs only to a person who's been made to grieve for weeks with a paying audience standing around watching. The experts all turned and looked at me when I came down the dock. The older guy, the clean but faded shirt, the work boots that had seen things. That polite, knowing little smirk that men with credentials keep tucked in their back pocket for a man who works with his hands and hasn't got a single letter after his name. One of them, I saw it plain, actually grinned at the fellow next to him. And I did not look at the boat. I need you to really catch that, because it turns out to be the whole entire thing. Every one of those gifted, expensive men had come down that dock and looked first and only at the machine. I didn't. I walked down and I looked at Genevieve and I said, "I'm awful sorry about your dad. Conrad was a friend of mine for 26 years. He talked about you all the time, all the time. I wanted you to know that." And that hollow-eyed woman's careful composure cracked straight down the center, just for a second. Because I don't think that in 3 solid weeks of $750,000 problem-solving, one single person had said one word to her about her father as an actual man. A person. A dad. They'd all come for the puzzle. Not one of them had come for her. And then I asked her the question that started everything. I said, "Genevieve, when they gave you your father's personal effects, the things that were in his pockets, in his coat, the last things he had on him, was there a bootlace? An old one, frayed, gone soft and dark, with a little brass tag on it about the size of a quarter, stamped with a number that's mostly rubbed off, and one little flat key threaded through it? He'd have carried it 30 years, would have looked like absolute junk, sitting next to the watch and the wallet and the good things." She stared at me a long moment, and then, slow, she nodded. She told me yes, the estate had catalogued it, that it was in a box somewhere with his reading glasses and his keys to the city truck, and that not one single person had thought a thing of it. Just an old worn-out bootlace with a tag and a little key, the kind of thing you'd find at the bottom of a junk drawer, worth maybe $5 at a hardware store. "That," I said, "that's what I want, not the $750,000. I don't want your money. I want that bootlace, please. Go and get it for me." And the experts laughed, right out loud, the whole knot of them. The old-timer wants a busted shoelace instead of $750,000. Can you believe this guy? Can you believe what wanders in off the lake? But Genevieve wasn't laughing. Genevieve was looking very, very hard at my face. and she turned and sent her assistant near running back up to the house for the box of her father's things. Now let me tell you exactly what I knew, standing in that glass boathouse, that not one of those brilliant men did, because it had nothing whatsoever to do with engineering, and everything in the world to do with having known the man. When Conrad restored the Evelyn, back in the 90s, he'd had a problem that every fellow with a valuable wooden boat in cottage country eventually has. These boats get stolen, or vandalized, or some clown's kid takes one for a joyride and wraps it around a dock. And Conrad, being who he was, did not trust fancy alarms, and he did not trust the marina security, and he did not trust anybody but himself with the thing his late wife's name was painted on. So he did what self-made men of his particular vintage always do. He fixed it himself. He had a hidden master cutoff switch wired into the boat, a little keyed marine disconnect, mounted up under the dash where you'd never find it and never think to look, that broke the whole ignition circuit stone dead unless you turned it. No power to the coil, no spark, nothing. The starter would crank all day long, and the engine would never, ever catch. The boat could be sitting in perfect mechanical health and behave, to any tester alive, exactly like a complete and total mystery. Which is, of course, precisely what it had been doing for 3 solid weeks, while $750,000 worth of the best people in the country chased imaginary ghosts around and around through its perfectly healthy wiring. There was never one single thing wrong with that boat. There was everything wrong with the fact that not one of them knew the hidden switch existed, because why on earth would they? And the one little flat key that turned it, the only thing in the world that woke that engine up and let it sing, had never once in 30 years lived in a key box, or a glove box, or any place sensible and organized person would think to keep it. Because I knew Conrad Halloran. And Conrad Halloran kept that key on a cheap brown bootlace, knotted to a worn brass luggage tag he'd had in his pocket since before Genevieve could walk, riding in the right front pocket of his trousers every single day for 30 years straight. The experts had taken one look at that thing in the box of effects and dismissed it on sight as garbage, because it looked exactly like garbage, and I knew, the second I walked in, that it was the only object in that entire glass cathedral that meant a single thing. They brought me the box. I opened it up, and there it was, his bootlace. The leather gone dark and soft and shaped permanent to the curve of his own pocket. The little brass tag rubbed nearly smooth and faceless by 30 years of his thumb worrying across it, an idle habit I'd watched him do 1,000 times, leaning on my fender, talking my ear off. I held it in my hand a second or two longer than I strictly needed to, because I had seen that exact object in that man's living hand more times than I could ever count, and holding it now was its own kind of grief and its own kind of grace, all braided up together. It was, for me, like hearing the snow shovel. Then I slid the little flat key off the bootlace, and I stepped down into the Evelyn, into Conrad's own helm seat, and I reached up under the dash to where I knew the switch would be, and I turned it. And then I put the ignition key in, the regular one, the one all of them had been using, and I turned that too. She caught on the first try. That big old straight 6 came roaring up out of 3 weeks of dead silence and filled that glass boathouse floor to ceiling, the deep wet burble of it rolling off the water and coming straight back at us, the living sound of a man who, it turned out, was not all the way gone after all. Not entirely. Not so long as his boat could still be made to sing his song. 3 weeks of the finest, most decorated marine minds money could summon up in this country, beaten, completely, flat-out beaten, by a $5 bootlace any one of them would have tossed in the trash without a second glance. And Genevieve made a sound I'm certain I'll carry to my own grave. She clapped both hands up over her mouth, and her knees just went out from under her, and she sank straight down onto that cold cedar floor in her good clothes, and she wept. And it wasn't the careful, contained, public grieving she'd been performing for a paying audience for weeks. It was the real thing. The deep thing. The one that comes up from the very bottom of a person. Because she was hearing her father again, the engine he had loved with his whole heart, running exactly the way it ran when he was alive and well, and standing at that helm with the wind in what was left of his hair. I'd given her back the snow shovel. I'd handed a grieving daughter one more ordinary, holy sound of the man she'd lost. I shut it down again gently after a minute, because you don't run a cold engine hard for long, and any mechanic worth his salt knows it, and Conrad would have clipped me upside the head for it besides. And the quiet that came down after wasn't the dead quiet that had been in that boathouse before. It was a different thing entirely. It was a quiet with the sound still living inside it. Every soul in that place felt it. Even the experts. The fellow from Montreal took his ball cap off without seeming to notice he'd done it. Nobody said a word for a good long while. You don't, in a quiet like that. You just let it be what it is. And Genevieve, still down on the floor, looked up at me through all of it and asked me why. Why in the world I hadn't taken the money. Anybody else alive would have taken it, she said. The experts most certainly would have taken it and argued for more on top. Why a $5 bootlace instead? So I lowered myself down and sat on that cold cedar floor right next to a weeping billionaire. Just two grieving people on the floor of a boathouse, which, underneath all the rest of it, was all either one of us really was. And I told her the truth. I told her about my own dad, just weeks in the ground. I told her about the snow shovel, and how I'd give every single thing I own to hear it scrape down that driveway one more cold morning. And I told her that taking $750,000 to start her father's boat would have felt to me, down in my gut, exactly like charging a grieving daughter money to hear her own dad's voice one last time. Like standing graveside with my hand held out. I didn't do it for the money, I told her. I did it because somebody I'd loved for 26 years was living in the sound of that engine, the same way somebody she'd loved her whole life was living in it. And you don't put a price tag on the act of handing a person their father back for 30 seconds. You just don't. I only wanted the bootlace, I told her, because I'd loved the old man too, in my own way, and I wanted one worn, ordinary, overlooked thing that his hands had closed around every single day for 30 years. That was payment enough. That was more than enough. That was a fortune. Now, I told you at the start this isn't a fairy tale, and I meant it. But the honest truth of how it ended is somehow gentler than any fairy tale would have been. Genevieve would not, in the end, let me walk out of that boathouse with only a bootlace. But, and this is the part that matters, she also didn't insult me, or the whole moment, by trying to shove that reward money into my hands, because by then she understood me too well for that. Instead, she did the quiet, dignified, exactly right thing that I've come to believe only the truly grieving, the truly changed, are even capable of. She'd learned that I had a little girl, my Nora, 11 years old, who I'm raising on my own and have been since she was 4, and who comes up to the marina with me on weekends and reads in the office and helps me sort fasteners into the little drawers. And she'd learned that the marina, the 3-generation family marina my grandfather started with his own 2 hands, was struggling along the slow, hard way every small, honest business in this country struggles to keep its head above water now. So she didn't write me a check. She knew better than that. She became, instead, the marina's patron in the old true sense of the word. She moved her whole collection up to us, and she has a collection, for all its care and keeping. And she told every wealthy boat-loving friend she has on that lake, and there are plenty, about the only mechanic her father ever trusted with the thing he loved most. 50, and inside of a single season, that struggling little marina with the cracked launch ramp had a wait list out the door and into next year. And my Nora has an education fund now, a real one, with her name on it, that'll see her through whatever she decides she wants to be. Genevieve handed my whole family a future, and she did it in a way I was actually able to accept with my spine still straight, one grieving person to another, with both our dignities left whole. And here's the part of all of it that I turn over most lying awake. My Nora gets to keep her family's marina someday, the one her great-grandfather built, the one I'll hand down to her if she ever wants it. And I think she might. The line didn't break. The same exact way Conrad's line doesn't break every time Genevieve takes the Evelyn out now, which she does. She told me once a week, just to hear it, run, just to hear him. She hardly ever takes it anywhere. She idles it out past the breakwater, and she shuts the engine, and she closes her eyes, and she just sits there on the water and listens to it tick as it cools. I'll never be a rich man. I make a decent living and I'll die owing the bank something, and that's fine by me. I once held a $5 bootlace in the palm of my hand instead of $750,000 in cash, and I have not regretted it for one single second of one single day since. Because there's a version of that afternoon where I take the money and I'm just a clever fellow who solved a hard problem and collected a fair reward and drove home a wealthy man. And there is no version of that afternoon where I do that and also get to be the man who sat down on a cold floor and gave a daughter her father's voice back for free, the way grief is supposed to be honored, gently and never once invoiced. The money would have bought a great many things. It could not have bought the look that came over Genevieve's face when that engine finally caught. I keep Conrad's bootlace on my own keys now, right next to the key to the shop. Worn brown leather, a little brass tag rubbed smooth and blank, and every time my thumb finds it without my meaning it to, I think of a man who drove an hour up the lake for 26 years because I listened to his boat instead of just fixing it. And I think of my own dad, gone now, and a driveway that stays silent every morning, no matter how hard it snows. And I think that maybe, just maybe, the whole entire point of a life spent with your two hands on things is finally learning that the cheapest, most worn-out, most completely overlooked object in the whole room is very often the only one in it that was ever holding any love at all. That night I tucked Nora into bed and she asked me, half asleep, if I'd fixed the fancy boat, because she'd seen that big glass boathouse out the truck window and been impressed by it. And I told her I had, yes, and she asked was it hard, and I said no, baby. It was about the easiest thing in the whole world. I just remembered somebody. She didn't understand what I meant by that, and that's all right. She will someday. A long, long time from now, if there's any mercy in this world, my girl is going to lose somebody she loves too, and she's going to find herself standing somewhere quiet and aching with her whole body, just to hear one small, plain, vanished sound one more time. And on that day she's going to understand every last thing her old man ever meant by it. I pray it's a long way off. But she'll have the marina, and she'll have the bootlace someday, and she'll understand. So let me ask you just one thing before you go. A whole boathouse full of certified geniuses came down that dock and saw a machine, and one tired old boat mechanic came down it and saw a man, and that right there is the whole difference in this world between a $750,000 failure and a $5 miracle. So here's what I honestly want to know from you tonight. What's the small, ordinary sound? The scrape of a shovel, a hummed tune, a screen door banging shut, that you'd give just about anything to hear one more time from someone you've lost. Tell me down in the comments. Say their name out loud if you want to. I read every single one, and I'd be truly honored to know. And if this one got to you, if you believe the way I've come to believe it right down to the ground, that love hides itself in the smallest, most overlooked things, and that the truest things in this life can't ever be bought or sold for any price, then hit subscribe if you haven't. Leave a like so the next person can find their way down to the dock too, and I'll see you in the next one. Trust me, it's a good one. Those men lost because they were brilliant, and I won because I bothered to remember a person. I've turned that over a lot of late nights since, and it still lands the same way. Every one of them came down that dock with more training in their little finger than I've got in my whole body, and not one of them could see the boat for the machine. Conrad's launch never had a single thing wrong with it. The whole problem was that the people looking at it had stopped looking at the man who owned it. I knew about that hidden switch under the dash because I'd spent 26 years actually listening to Conrad lean on my fender and talk. And listening turns out to be its own kind of skill, slower than a diagnostic and worth 100 times more. The smartest thing I did in that boathouse wasn't clever at all. It was just paying attention to a man for a quarter of a century until I knew where he hid his heart. But knowing wasn't the hard part. The hard part was sitting on that cold cedar floor and turning down $750,000 with my Nora's education fund, sitting empty back home and the marina drowning. That's the thing nobody tells you. Doing the decent thing isn't decent if it costs you nothing. It only counts when it's expensive, when your hands are shaking, and the easy money is right there and you walk away from it anyway, because some line inside you won't be crossed. I walked away from it. And here's the strange arithmetic of a life, the part I'd want my girl to understand someday. Because I wouldn't be bought, Genevieve trusted me. Because she trusted me, she rebuilt everything I have. The honest road and the road that fed my kid turned out, in the end, to be the very same road. They don't always. But you have to be willing to walk the honest one even when you can't see that it does. And none of it would have happened if I'd quit. I nearly told Brennan no. I was empty. My own dad weeks in the ground. No fight left. But I drove up that lake anyway, because the people who get to fix the unfixable thing are almost never the most gifted ones in the room. They're just the ones who showed up tired and stayed. Remember a person instead of a machine. Refuse to sell the part of yourself that isn't for sale. And keep going on the mornings the driveway's silent and you've got nothing left. Do those 3 things year after year, and one day you'll walk into a glass room full of geniuses with a $5 Bootlace in your pocket and hand a grieving daughter back the sound of her father. That's not luck. That's just who you slowly became while nobody was watching.